The morning of October 12, 1940, blanketed New York's Pier 17 in a thick, cold fog. The Hudson River murmured softly, its surface barely visible, as dockworkers moved like shadows between stacks of cargo and crates. War had changed everything. The city buzzed with uncertainty, its streets echoing with newspaper boys shouting headlines about Europe's descent into chaos. But at the dock that morning, all that mattered to Captain Samuel Hargrove was that his wife hadn't arrived yet. He stood near the loading ramp of the USS Montgomery, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets, eyes scanning the street that disappeared into mist. The Montgomery was scheduled to depart for Liverpool at noon, a supply mission escorted by the Navy, carrying crucial aid to Britain. For months, Samuel had begged Evelyn to stay behind in Boston with her sister, but she insisted on accompanying him to the harbor to say goodbye. She said she'd be on the 6:45 train, just like always, but the train had arrived, and Evelyn hadn't. He checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. Las 11:07 al toma, cold knot twisted in his stomach. Captain Hargrove, a voice called. It was Ensign Donnelly, clipboard in hand, face flushed from the chill. "We need your signature for the cargo manifest." Samuel nodded and signed it absently, eyes drifting toward the street. Nothing but fog and silence. A dull metallic clang echoed from the port's edge. Two dockworkers argued about rope placement, their voices muffled by the mist. Samuel caught a glimpse of a woman's figure in the distance, tall, slim, wearing a dark coat and hat. But when he moved toward her, the figure disappeared around a corner. He quickened his pace. "Evelyn," he called. No answer. Only the groan of a ship adjusting to the tide. He reached the alley behind the dock warehouse. Empty. The air smelled of salt and oil. A stray cat darted past a stack of barrels. Samuel leaned against the wall and tried to steady his breath. He had fought in the Great War, survived open-sea gunfire and storm-black nights. But this silence, this sense of something wrong, just out of reach, this terrified him. He returned to the ship just as final boarding was called. Ensign Donnelly was waiting. "Sir, orders say we cast off at 12 sharp." Samuel hesitated. His heart begged him to wait. Just 5 more minutes, but duty screamed louder, especially now, with Europe bleeding and the country on edge. He turned one last time to look at the dock, hoping, praying, she'd step out of the mist. She never did. The USS Montgomery pulled away from the pier at 12:01 p.m. Samuel stood at the railing, eyes fixed on the place she should have been, hand gripping the brass rail until his knuckles turned white. Below deck, in his private cabin, a small satchel lay unopened. Inside was a locket she had given him on their wedding day. Inside the locket, a tiny photo of them both smiling on a sunny Boston afternoon. He hadn't opened it in weeks. 2 weeks after the USS Montgomery departed New York, Captain Samuel Hargrove returned to Boston under gray skies and an aching heart. The mission had gone according to plan, supplies delivered, storm weathered, convoy intact. But Samuel had returned with no sense of victory. The only thing that mattered now was Evelyn. When he climbed the worn steps to their brownstone apartment in Beacon Hill, something in him hoped to hear her humming through the hallway, maybe spot her coat on the rack, or smell the faint aroma of her favorite lilac perfume. Instead, silence met him. He unlocked the door with trembling hands. The apartment was exactly as they'd left it 3 weeks earlier. 2 cups by the sink, a half-read mystery novel beside the armchair. The quilt Evelyn had been sewing, a patchwork of old handkerchiefs, still folded neatly in a basket. He called out softly, "Evelyn." No answer, just the ticking of the clock on the mantel and the distant rattle of a streetcar. He checked the bedroom. Her suitcase still sat by the wardrobe, unopened. Her traveling gloves were in the drawer. She hadn't packed. Samuel sat on the edge of the bed, confused. If she hadn't come to the dock, if she hadn't traveled to New York, where had she gone? The following morning, he visited her sister, Margaret, who lived across town. She opened the door with wide, surprised eyes. "Samuel," she gasped. "You're back." "I am. I thought Evelyn might be here." Margaret stepped aside slowly, face pale. "She's not. I haven't seen her since the week before you left. She told me she was staying with you the night before the ship," Samuel said, his voice flat. Margaret shook her head. "She never arrived. I thought she changed her mind and stayed at home." That night, Samuel filed a missing person report with the Boston police. He provided every detail he could: height, hair color, clothing, habits, last known whereabouts. A weary officer took his statement and promised to keep an eye out. Though the war had stretched the department thin, days turned into weeks. No word, no sightings, no letters. Her bank account untouched. Her friends unaware. It was as though Evelyn had stepped off the face of the earth. Samuel hired a private investigator, a retired Pinkerton man with a limp and a hawk-like gaze. The man chased down every lead. Train stations, bus stops, boarding houses, nothing. Some whispered theories floated among acquaintances. Perhaps she'd run off. Perhaps she'd had secrets. But Samuel refused to believe it. Evelyn was gentle, thoughtful, loyal to her very bones. She wouldn't leave without a word, not without telling him why. By December, as the snow began to fall and the nation inched closer to war, Samuel stopped sleeping. He sat by the window most nights, watching the street below, imagining her turning the corner in a wool coat, carrying a basket of fresh bread and apples. But she never came. In February 1941, a letter arrived at his door. It was from the private investigator, Captain Hargrove. I regret to inform you that despite exhaustive efforts, I have found no trace of Mrs. Evelyn Hargrove. There is no record of hospital admission, no confirmed witness sightings, and no indication she crossed the state border. I fear we must accept the possibility that she either left of her own accord or met with foul play. Samuel folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beside the bed. He never hired another investigator. He never remarried, and each year on October 12th he stood silently by the edge of Pier 17 in New York, watching the fog roll in, waiting. Autumn in Boston always had a certain poetry to it. The crisp air, the scent of old paper and fallen leaves. On a rainy afternoon in 1970, a young graduate student named Claire Whitmore ducked into an old secondhand bookshop on Beacon Street, seeking shelter and, hopefully, a rare edition of Whitman. The shop was dimly lit, and dust hung in the air like memories. Shelves groaned with volumes worn by time. The bell above the door jingled faintly as she entered, and an elderly man behind the counter looked up. Nodding silently, Claire wandered to the back, where the biographies and war journals were kept. She always had an interest in personal histories, stories forgotten in time. As her fingers traced spines faded by decades, she paused at a battered green leather-bound volume titled simply Letters and Leaves. It didn't appear to be published. There was no author name. Curious, she opened the front cover. Inside, she found a folded piece of thick paper, yellowed at the edges and sealed with a wax stamp, now cracked and flaking. She hesitated. She wasn't sure if she should open it, but something, a chill, a whisper of instinct, compelled her to peel it open. It was a letter, handwritten in delicate cursive. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. October 12, 1940, my dearest Samuel. If you're reading this, it means I was never able to return to you, but please, know that I tried. I tried with every ounce of strength I had. The truth is not simple. I've kept a secret I never meant to carry alone. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The letter went on, describing a hidden pregnancy, a rendezvous gone wrong at the port, a sudden disappearance for his protection. The name Evelyn Hargrove appeared near the end. Claire closed the letter slowly. She had never heard of Evelyn Hargrove before, but the raw emotion in the writing was unmistakable. It was a goodbye, a confession, and a cry for someone to remember. Her truth. She took the book and letter to the front counter. How much for this? She asked. The old man squinted at the cover, shrugged. $3. Claire handed over a crumpled bill, then hurried out into the rain. Back at her apartment, she read the letter again, this time fully. It painted the picture of a woman, afraid, yet determined. It mentioned someone who had followed her, a man she referred to only as the Shadow. It mentioned that she had discovered something before her departure, something they would kill to keep quiet. There was no signature at the end, only a simple, incomplete line. And if ever this reaches you, know that I have always. The letter stopped there. Claire, fascinated and moved, brought the letter to the university archives the next morning. She asked about Samuel Hargrove. Within hours, records surfaced. Naval officer, service from 1937 to 1946, widowed, never remarried. They found newspaper clippings from 1940, reporting his wife missing. No body ever recovered, no suspects, no resolution. Claire stood over the dusty microfilm machine in stunned silence. This letter was real, and it had been waiting 30 years to be found. The morning sun streamed through the dusty windows of the Boston Naval Archives. Claire sat at a long oak table. The letter from Evelyn laid gently before her, now sealed in a protective sleeve. Her mind buzzed with questions. Who was the shadow? What had Evelyn discovered, and why had she vanished so completely? She wasn't a historian, at least not yet, but something about this story had latched onto her heart. It didn't feel like research. It felt like a responsibility. One name kept echoing in her thoughts: Samuel Hargrove. He had survived the war. He had waited, and now, 30 years later, a part of his past had finally surfaced. Claire pulled out the directory. Records. To her surprise, Captain Hargrove was still alive, 86 years old, living alone in a quiet seaside town in Maine. That same afternoon, she boarded a northbound train with the letter tucked safely in her bag. The ride was long, and the passing trees blurred into autumn fire. She rehearsed what she'd say, how to explain that a piece of his heart had been waiting in a bookshop all these years. The small coastal village of Rockport greeted her with chilly wind and the scent of salt. A local cab driver knew the house. Captain Hargrove, the man asked, hasn't had a visitor in years, lives by himself. Quiet type. The house was weathered but neat, perched on a cliff's edge like it had been built to watch the sea forever. Claire stepped up to the door and knocked gently. No answer. She knocked again. After a long pause, the door creaked open. A tall, thin man stood there, dressed in a sweater that looked older than she was. His eyes were sharp despite the heavy wrinkles, and his voice was low but firm. Yes, Captain Hargrove, Claire asked. My name is Claire Whitmore. I found something I think belongs to you. He looked at her hands. At the envelope, there was a long silence. Then, without a word, he stepped aside to let her in. The living room was simple. Wooden floors, faded photographs, a grandfather clock ticking steadily in the corner. Claire sat carefully on the edge of an armchair while the captain remained standing, arms crossed, like a man bracing for an old wound to open. I found this in a bookshop in Boston, she said, carefully placing the letter on the table. It was inside an old book. It's from Evelyn. At the sound of the name, his eyes flickered. His hands trembled as he reached for the sleeve. He didn't open it at first. He just stared at it. Then, slowly, carefully, he pulled the letter from its cover and began to read. Tears welled. Almost instantly he read it twice, then a third time. When he finally looked up, his voice cracked. She was alive that day, he whispered. I waited at the dock until the ship left. They said she never boarded. I searched for her for years. I even hired private investigators after the war. And now, he pressed the letter to his chest. Thought I'd gone mad, he added, chuckling bitterly. All these years thinking I missed something, that I'd failed her. Claire sat in silence, unsure of what to say. Finally, the captain looked at her. Thank you, he said simply. You brought her back to me. The following morning, Claire sat across from Captain Hargrove in the modest kitchen. A steaming mug of black coffee sat untouched in front of him. The letter lay on the table once more, carefully unfolded, as if he couldn't bear to put it away. I still don't understand why she never got on that ship, he said, voice hoarse from a sleepless night. She was there. She wrote this the day we were supposed to leave. Claire had spent the night at a small inn in town, unable to sleep herself. The mystery had grown deeper, more personal. There was something unfinished in Evelyn's words, something unspoken. She turned to the last lines of the letter. I now see what they never wanted me to. If anything happens, don't look for me. Forgive me, Sam. Claire looked up. Who do you think she meant by they? The captain shook his head. I've wondered that for 30 years. Evelyn wasn't paranoid. She was smart, observant. She said something strange 2 days before we planned to leave. Said she felt like someone was watching her near the train station. That was new. Train station. Claire leaned forward. Do you remember where she was staying? She was living with her aunt in South Boston at the time. She would have taken the early train from South Station to the docks in New York. Claire made a decision. I want to follow this, she said. I think there's more to this story. The captain nodded. If there is, it's buried deep, but I'll help you however I can. Back in Boston, Claire headed straight for the city archives. It took hours to locate the old train logs from April 1940, and then a small note in faded ink. Disturbance reported. Woman seen being escorted off platform by unknown man in dark uniform. No report filed. Her breath caught. She photocopied the page and rushed to the Historical Police Records Department. After some convincing, an archivist agreed to help her dig through the incident reports from that week. There it was. April 18, 1940. A woman matching Evelyn Hargrove's description had been detained for questioning after causing unrest at the South Station terminal. The file ended abruptly. No follow-up, no transfer, no official charges. Claire's heart pounded. She drove back to Rockport with copies of everything. Captain Hargrove listened in stunned silence as she laid it all before him. She didn't miss the train, Claire said softly. She was stopped. The captain stared at the documents, his hands clenched. All this time, he whispered, they said she disappeared, that maybe she'd run off, but someone took her. Claire hesitated. Do you know why someone would do that? He looked away. I was vocal, he admitted. Spoke out against certain orders, wrote letters. Evelyn typed most of them for me. She knew what I knew. She wasn't just my wife, she was my confidant, my conscience. He exhaled slowly. There were men who didn't like that. The room fell into silence. Then he whispered, they didn't just take her, they erased her. Claire's pulse raced. For the first time, she realized this story might be bigger than she imagined. Not just a vanished woman, not just a love lost, but something darker and deliberately hidden. And now, 30 years later, the truth was starting to breathe again. Claire knew she had uncovered something important, something Evelyn had tried to hint at in her final message. The pieces were forming a mosaic of fear, secrecy, and injustice, but the image was still unclear. She needed one more thread to tie it all together. She contacted a local journalist in Boston, an old friend from university named Paul Riley. He had worked on several Cold War exposes and knew how to follow the shadow trails that others ignored. Paul was intrigued by the story. A woman vanished in 1940, possibly silenced because of what she knew. That's more than news, Claire. That's buried history. They started digging. Within a week, Paul unearthed an obscure memo from a naval intelligence officer, dated April 19, 1940, one day after Evelyn's disappearance. The note was brief but chilling. Civilian interference neutralized. Subject removed. HH confirms compliance. It didn't name names, but the timing was damning. Claire brought the memo to Captain Hargrove. His eyes darkened as he read the line. HH, he whispered. Henry Hollister, my former superior. He rose from his chair with a stiffness that came from more than just age. He always warned me to keep quiet. Said I had no idea what I was poking at. But Evelyn kept urging me to expose the corruption. She believed we had a duty. She typed every letter, every draft. She believed in truth. Claire leaned forward. Do you think he had her taken? I think ... yes. And I think she knew it was coming. The next morning, Claire and Paul drove back to South Station. They traced the steps Evelyn might have taken on that day in 1940, from the train car, down the platform, toward the exit where the report had been filed. There was an old janitor named Ray, who had worked there for 50 years. Claire introduced herself gently, showed him Evelyn's photo. His eyes widened. I remember her, he said slowly. She wore gloves, always had this calm, polite way. That morning, ... she was nervous, kept looking over her shoulder. I tried to help her with her bag, but she said no. Claire's heart pounded. What happened next? Ray rubbed his hands together, the memory returning like a faded photograph in water. She was talking to a man in uniform. Not navy blue, it was darker, like federal. They walked off together. I figured it was her husband, but then, she never came back. He looked at Claire with sorrow. I always wondered what happened to her. Something about it didn't sit right. Claire thanked him, hands shaking. Another witness, another confirmation. Back at the captain's house, she placed the final evidence on his kitchen table. The memo, the witness testimony, the South Station record. Captain Hargrove looked at it all, then slowly reached into the bottom drawer of his desk. He pulled out an envelope, aged, unsealed, yellow with time. She sent this to my mother, he said, postmarked 2 days after the date of her disappearance. But it didn't arrive until months later. My mother never told me. Until after the war. He opened it with trembling fingers and handed Claire the single page inside. If you're reading this, Sam, then I failed to get on the ship. But not because I didn't want to. They stopped me. I don't know where I'm going, but I want you to know, I did it for you. I did it because they couldn't silence both of us. Someone has to tell the truth. I hope you will." Tears welled in Claire's eyes. It was a sacrifice, a choice. She gave up her safety to protect the man she loved, and maybe, just maybe, to give him the chance to speak for them both. Captain Hargrove clutched the page to his chest. "I never stopped loving her," he whispered. "And now, I know she never stopped fighting for me." Claire's breath caught as she stepped back from the captain's desk. Evelyn's final letter echoed in her mind like a hymn, mournful, brave, unfinished. There were no clear answers, only a mosaic of truths barely allowed to surface. Captain Hargrove folded the letter again with reverence and placed it in a tin box alongside a few photos, a dried daisy, and a ribbon that once belonged to Evelyn. "I never told anyone about this box," he murmured. "It was all I had left of her, but I didn't know I also had her voice, her will." Claire placed a hand on his. "You still do, and we need to share it." Together, with Paul Riley's help, they compiled everything: the memo, the witness, statement from the janitor, the postmarked letter, and a new article detailing Evelyn's abrupt disappearance. They titled it, "The Hidden Cost of Silence: What Happened to Evelyn Hargrove." It was published in the Boston Globe a week later. The article struck a chord. Letters poured in from veterans, old journalists, even retired civil servants. Some shared memories, others shared regret. One anonymous envelope arrived with no return address and only a single line: "She knew too much." But she was right. The buzz around the story eventually reached a small government archive in D.C., where a retired analyst named Miriam Ellison recognized the initials HH. From old Navy intelligence logs, she contacted Claire and confirmed that Henry Hollister had been involved in civilian detainments during pre-war tensions. "They called it protective relocation," she said. But in truth, it was meant to erase those who asked too many questions. With her help, Claire obtained declassified documents, most redacted, but a few revealing. A transport manifest listed E. Hargrove among civilian detainees, redirected from Boston to a secure holding facility in upstate New York. Dated April 18, 1940. Evelyn never left the country. She was detained on home soil. Claire whispered, stunned, but what happened next? There were no further logs under Evelyn's name. The trail ended in July 1940. The same month, Hargrove received his first overseas command. That summer, Evelyn vanished, not just from the dock, but from the system. Claire traveled to upstate New York. The old holding facility had long since been converted into a youth reform center, but the land still held echoes. She walked the grounds, imagining Evelyn pacing behind tall fences, waiting for news, hoping her sacrifice had not been in vain. As she stood beneath a weeping willow, a breeze rustled the trees. She closed her eyes and whispered, "You're not forgotten, Evelyn, not anymore." Back in Boston, Captain Hargrove held a small memorial at the bay, where Evelyn was last seen. A bench was installed with a plaque that read, "In memory of Evelyn Hargrove, truth-teller, beloved wife, and silent hero." The community gathered quietly, a few reporters, neighbors, and those who had read the story and felt something shift inside. Hargrove spoke only briefly. "She believed in justice," he said, voice trembling, "and even in the face of fear, she never abandoned it. I failed to protect her, but I will never fail to honor her." He placed her letter in a sealed box beneath the plaque, alongside a single white rose. Later, as twilight draped the harbor, Claire stood beside the captain and asked, "Do you regret knowing the truth?" He shook his head. "No, truth is heavy, Claire, but silence is heavier." Decades later, school children would sit by the plaque at the harbor, asking their teachers about the name carved in brass. Who was Evelyn Hargrove? They'd ask, and the answer would no longer be silence. She became part of Boston's memory, not as a ghost, but as a woman who stood firm when it would have been easier to disappear. Her story, once buried beneath decades of indifference, now whispered in library shelves, echoed in university halls, and lived on in quiet benches by the sea. Captain Hargrove passed away in 1983, but his final request was honored, to be buried with Evelyn's last letter in his coat pocket and her ribbon in his hand. Claire would go on to write a book, not just about Evelyn, but about all the forgotten women who risked everything during wartime and were erased from the records. The book was titled, Her Voice Carried, The Forgotten Courage of Evelyn Hargrove. Sometimes, it doesn't take a monument to remember someone. It only takes a story passed down with care, one voice, refusing to fade. What about you? Was there a moment in this story that moved you? Have you ever discovered something from the past that changed the way you saw someone? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about the forgotten voices in our own families. Like if Evelyn's story touched your heart, subscribe to our channel for more emotional true stories that deserve to be told. And remember, some truths may sleep for decades until someone dares a second look.